This is a re-recording of lesson 2 of Comp2084. The hour 1 video recorded properly, but the hour 2 and 3 videos captured my audio but didn't capture any of my screen share. So I'm going to redo those, probably condensed into a single video. So there was a question at the end of hour 1 about why would we ever use the debugger. We talked about using start without debugging so we can make changes. Our code editor is not locked and we don't have to constantly stop and restart our editor. So the time where we would use the debugging, where we'd click start debugging instead, is probably only about 1% of the time. And that's where we actually want to put a breakpoint in our code and step through it line by line. So if we look at this student project, let's say I want to investigate the project details method and watch the code execute at runtime. So I put a breakpoint in here. You're probably used to doing this from your C# class. Now, if I start the project, but start debugging, the project will compile. It'll load in IIS Express. It'll open up in a new browser. But we can see how runtime debugging works with .NET. This is something that wasn't available to us in our PHP class. We had no way to step through our PHP code line by line as it executes. Because our .NET code is compiled, we can do it. So if I click on project and then click on details, notice as soon as my details method gets executed, we can now debug. So I can inspect, okay, what was the ID parameter? And by hitting the F11 key, I can walk through the code one line at a time. Is our ID null? If so, it would return a not found, but it's not. Our ID isn't null, so this is going to use our project model and query the database for project ID 2. And then it's going to check if our query found a project, which it did. So at runtime, I can see all of the properties of this project. Project ID 2, deadline August 15th, project name Rich's project. And then bounces down here to the last line, which returns our view and passes in the selected project. So this would be an instance, the rare instance where we're going to run in debug mode because maybe we want to inspect our code line by line. Maybe we're getting an error or we're not getting the result in the browser that we're expecting. So Visual Studio offers this runtime debugging. So that's pretty much the only time I'm going to choose that start debugging. And now my code is locked. I'm going to press stop. So I'm going to go back to our .NET Drinks project. I've created a second project called .NET Drinks 2 because I'm going to redo the changes that I had done in our live class that didn't record properly. So I will start without debugging. And this is the state the project was in at the end of the first hour. So I'm going to redo the remaining parts of the class in this video. So I'll start without debugging, launches our app. So in the first hour of class, we created the brands controller. Visual Studio automatically gave it an index method, and then we've just created a view here that says our brands. Right, go to localhost, our local port number, and then we get this. So what we want to do on here, first we're going to hard code some brands on here. I'm going to go back to my code editor. And we're going to open up here a UL tag. And we're going to put on 5 brands of alcohol suppliers that might supply products in our store. So I'm going to use the same ones that we did in our live lesson. So we'll put on, let's say, we'll start with Canadian Club. So these were things that students suggested in the chat during class. We had Molson. Go ahead, get it. JP Wiser and Jackson Trades. Okay, so we've got a list here. If I go back and refresh, just some static HTML. So the next thing we want to do is we want to turn these into links so the user can click on a brand and it's going to take them off to a brand's details view. So I'm going to wrap each one of these in an anchor tag. And I'm going to use the ASP directive. So I'm going to use ASP controller equal brands. And our ASP action will be details. I'll just, that should be Canadian Club. That's going to go inside my link tag. So if I refresh the browser now, Canadian Club should be turned into an item I can click on. And then we're going to do the same thing with the other 4 brand names. Go back and refresh. And now Canadian Club is a link. When I click it right now, it goes to brands details, but I get a blank screen because this method doesn't exist yet. So I'm going to make the other 4 brands links as well. So I'm just going to copy this anchor tag. In front of each of my links. And then I'll just grab the end anchor tag and put it after each brand name, but before each LI tag ends. Now notice also my code's a little bit inconsistent. Visual Studio has a neat way to nest and properly format our HTML. So if I just select everything on the page, or I can select just a block of code, whatever you want. If I right click and choose Format Selection, it now properly kind of spaces out my tags. So if I want to do it this way, again, I can highlight everything. And if I format, it'll now indent, it'll nest my anchor tags. So now each one of these is a link. We'll have to do a little more on these links in a minute, but now I can click any of them, and any brand name will take me to call the details method. So now I need to go back to my controller. We're going to need to create a method called details. And then we're going to need to create a view that also has that name. Go back to my brands controller. And we'll create a new method here that returns an iAction result called details in Pascal case, so with a capital D. It's also going to return a view. And I like to put in the path so I know what URL will invoke this method. That's optional, but it's common practice in our .NET controllers. So now we've got our details method. So if we refresh, we're going to get a different result now. Instead of a blank screen, right, our details method, it now exists, but there is no view. So we have to now create the details view. So just go back to my controller. I'll right click the details method. I'll choose add a view. It's going to be empty. And I will call it details. I don't need to put on the extension and I get an empty view. I'll just put an H1 on here and we'll say brand info. So now if I go back to the browser and refresh, that error should go away and we should get a page with this H1 tag up at the top. Let's try it. So now our brand info shows up, heading shows up, our details page is working. Now, there's a bit of a limit here. Problem is, all of these links, they all go to the exact same place. But once we're here, we want to show what brand the user clicked on. The problem is all of these links are identical. They just call the details. So we need to do three things. We need to modify our links on the index view so that we can pass in the name of a brand when we call the details method. We then need to modify the method signature of the details method to accept a string parameter. And then we're going to render that string parameter, put it in the view bag so we can render it in our view. So we're going to go back. So we're going to need to modify all three of the files that we have open. We'll start here on index. So on our links, we're going to add one more property, one more attribute, one more of these ASP attributes to our anchor tags. And that is, we're going to say ASP root, and then I'm going to define a variable called name. So I've added this code highlighted in blue. Let's see what this does in the browser. Minimize, shrink this down so we can still see the code. Let's go back to brands, I'll refresh. So now I'm going to click my first link that has this ASP root name equals Canadian Club. And you can see what that does. That now appends a parameter called name onto the end of our URL, and it passes in the value that I'm setting for the ASP root name attribute. So I need to do the same thing on my other four links. Because if I click one of my other links, right now, they're all just calling details, but there is no root name attribute. So I can add this same attribute. I'll just copy this three times. And then I need to place the values inside. So the root name will be Molson, and so on. I'm going to copy each brand name as the ASP root name value. So now each link is still going to call the details method, but it's also going to pass in the name of the brand the user clicked on. So we can evaluate and display that value on the next page. I'll go back and refresh. And now when I click JP Weiser, that value's in the URL. When I click Molson, that value's in the URL. So that was step one. Add these ASP root name attributes to each of our links. Now we need to go to the brands controller, and we need to modify the method signature to accept a string parameter called name. So I'll also put that here in my comment so we know. So we'll define a string parameter that's called name. Then we want to read the name param from the URL and put it in the view bag, display on this view. So we'll use view bag, and I'll set up a name property. So we're going to take our incoming parameter, we're going to stick it in the view bag in a variable called name. So that was step two, modify the controller method, modify our details, method signature to accept a string parameter, and then take that value, put it in the view bag. Our final step, if we run this code right now, we're not going to see any change on the details page. So if I refresh, where I'm still passing in the name of Molson, we haven't actually modified anything in the HTML. So nothing shows up here. Now I'm going to go back to my brand's details view. And we'll just output in an H2 tag the viewbag.name. So now whatever brand name we clicked on the previous page, that is going to be rendered in an H2 tag on the details page. Let's try this out. So again, the first request is slow because the site is recompiling because we've made changes to C#. So now whatever's in the name shows up here. Now what happens if this name parameter isn't here? Right? What if I take that out and I leave it blank? Seems to be okay, but there's one problem, which is we're rendering this H2 tag unnecessarily. Right? There's nothing inside it, so we probably shouldn't show this tag. So we can add a little bit of logic to the view so that this H2 only shows up when there's something here in the name. So we could add the logic in the controller, or we could add it in the view. I'm going to add it in the view. So I'm going to wrap this in an if statement. We can write logic, just put in an @if. Now we don't need the @ symbol again here for viewbag because this line already is server-side code. It starts with an @ symbol. So if viewbag.name isn't null, this is where my format code is handy. Say format the selection. So if we have something in the viewbag, print it out. I'll actually just add an else statement here. Otherwise, let's add a link to go back to the index page. Our controller is brands. And our action is index. So go back to the previous page. We'll just say click to see our brands. Again, I want to format this. I'm not sure why it's indented out so far. We'll bring it back here. So we're not going to get that empty H2 tag anymore. If the viewbag is empty, instead of rendering those empty H2 and ending H2, we're going to print a different message. So if I have no name being passed to details, I get this. I go back, and now when I pick, my brand shows up. Now we could also write the logic, if we wanted to, in here. We could evaluate name and say if it's null, redirect automatically, take the user back to the index view. I think I'll leave it running this way for now. So we're hard coding things here, but now you can see, starting to see how we can use controllers and views to move around and navigate and pass data, pass information from page to page in the site. Now, I'm going to comment this out. I want to rejig this a bit. We're going to start working with our database in lesson 4, but I actually want to mock up the data in the controller instead and look at how do we take data from the controller and pass it to the view. So far, we've just used the viewbag, which is a fairly crude object. It's loosely typed, and it's okay to pass a string value, but we wouldn't really want to pass a list of data this way. There's a better way of doing it. So what we're going to do, I'm going to go to my index, and I'm going to comment out all of this. So I'm just going to highlight our 5 li tags. I'll leave the code here. I'm just going to click on the comment out the selected lines button, or you can just use @ and * to commented the block. So if I go back and refresh my index page, my list is hidden, gone. So we're going to mock this up instead. I'm going to go over my Solution Explorer. I'm going to right click on my models folder, and I'm going to add a class. Class names in .NET, similar to in Java, they should be singular. They should always start with a capital letter. So I'm going to call my class brand. You can assign the .cs extension if you like. If you leave it out, Visual Studio will automatically give you the .cs extension because we're working in a C# project. So we've got a class called brand, and I want to define 3 properties of a brand. We'll have an int called ID with a getter and setter. And I'm going to put a note in here. In .NET MVC, the .NET MVC convention, PK fields named ID or so there's really only 2 ways you should be naming your primary key fields. And you should be using Pascal case in your models, either capital I, lowercase d, or the name of your class, and then ID. So ID or brand ID. If I use either one of these, then Visual Studio knows this is the primary key field. If I call it something else, it's just going to get treated like a regular integer. We'll have a string for the name with a getter and setter, and an int for the year founded. So how old is the company? Okay, so there's our model. In week 4, we're going to define some models for our e-commerce store, the liquor store we're building, and then we can actually use Visual Studio to generate tables in the database that are mapped to our models, which is cool. Saves us a lot of time. So now we want to use this model in our controller. So instead of hard coding the brand names here, we're going to mock up a list of brand objects. And then we want to pass that to the index view and redo our list using a loop. So in our index method, we want to use the brand model to create a mock list of brand objects. To display on the index view. So I'm going to declare a variable called brands. And normally in .NET, variables are implicitly typed. So we use var a lot. It doesn't mean it has no type. It means Visual Studio will automatically interpret and assign the data type. So this is going to be a new list of type brand. You've probably worked with lists in your C# course before, and we're getting an error when I do this, right? It says brand is not recognized. So that's odd. We have a public class called brand, but it's not visible. And the reason it's not visible has to do with the namespaces. So our controllers, you see the path, our brands controller is in the controllers folder. So when we created it in this folder, Visual Studio automatically puts it in the controllers namespace. Our model, we created it in the, you see the path, the models folder. So Visual Studio gives it its own namespace inside the project. So the 2 namespaces don't see each other. So how do we fix this? Well, Visual Studio, most of the time, we want to use the code hinting. So if I just mouse over this error, get this little pop-up, it says show potential fixes. And if I click here, it says, well, make a reference to the model's namespace. And then you have access, we'll have access from the controller to the brand model. So I'll just click that. and it automatically, Visual Studio adds a reference on line 1. The red underline goes away. The brand model is now recognized. I could manually make this reference. I could just type the using statement, but I find it faster. Let Visual Studio use the code hinting when possible. So I'm going to create 5 brands, the same 5 brands we used before, but I'm going to assign each one an ID. And then in class, collaboratively, students found the years founded. So I'm going to add those. So I'm going to add one at a time to make a new brand. And notice when I say brand, the 3 properties we defined in our model class show up: ID, name. So I'll start at ID 100, Canadian Club, and our year founded, we found out, was 1902. So I'm going to copy this and then just change the values. Copy it 4 times. I'm going to change my IDs to 101, 2, 3, and 4. And our second brand was Molson, which is founded in way back in 1786. Which is founded in 1883. J.P. Weiser in 1853. And Jackson Triggs, which is an Ontario winery down in near Niagara Falls. Relatively recent at 1993. So now we need to modify the return statement. We want to pass the brands list to the view for display. So when we call the view, this return view method, it actually has 4 overloads. So we've been calling the empty overload so far where we don't pass it anything. But the second overload takes 1 parameter, which is a data model. So we're going to pass our brands list to our view. Now I can reload the page, but nothing's going to happen yet. If I go and refresh, we're not going to see any changes here yet. So we've used the model, we've mocked up some data, we've passed the data to the view, but there's no code on here to take that data and display it. So we want to modify that. So we need to do 2 things. First thing we need to do at the very top of the view is we need to set a model declaration. Right? Remember here, when we looked at the overload, we are now passing in a data model. So our page has to have this @model declaration where we define what kind of data this view is expecting to get from the controller. So I'm going to have my project name. So for me, it's .NET Drinks 2. Our project in class is just .NET Drinks. .models .brand. Now what this means, this page is expecting a brand object, which is true, but it's not fully correct. We're not passing a single brand to this page. We are passing a list of brands, right? This variable is a list of type brand. So to indicate this is a list, we need to wrap this class with a decorator of I enumerable. And then in angled brackets, we define our class. So I enumerable means this page is receiving a list that we can iterate through, we can loop through, of this type of data. So now we can rewrite this loop. We can rewrite this using a for each loop. So I'll put on an @ symbol. So we want to loop through each var B. I'll just create a variable called B, short for brand, in our model. And I'll open a set of curly braces. And in here, we're going to output. We'll just start. We won't make these links yet. We want to output the B dot. And notice, because our model is strongly typed, see, we don't get this with the view bag. The view bag is untyped. But if we pass in we declare a strongly typed model, we have access to the properties of that model. So let's say we want to just output b.name. So now the page is going to look like it did the first time when we had just hard-coded in a list of names. So now if I refresh, the brand names, our list, is going to come back, which it does. Now, we have more than just the name this time. We also have, I could put in brackets, @b dot year founded. So we want to show the name, and then we're going to put in brackets the year it was founded. That comes from our model class. So we'll reload. So now we've got the name and the year. And then lastly, we want to turn these back into links so users can click on any brand name and it will take them to the details page. Go back. And now inside, just nest things a bit so our code's more readable. And we'll put our anchor tags back on. So our ASP controller is brands. Our ASP action, as before, is details. And our ASP root name, now instead of hard coding this, we are going to make it dynamic with our b @b.name. So we're going to inject our server-side variable. And then I'm going to close my anchor. So here. So b.name is used twice. Once for the root name parameter and once for the display, the text of the link. So the page is going to now look like it did originally, except we've also got this year founded here. But our code is much lighter because it's dynamic, it's using a loop. So if we modify the list in the controller, we don't have to modify anything in the view. The view will automatically update. If we have 5 brands, 50 brands, 500 brands. So now when I refresh, so now I can click, passes our brand name to our details view. So we've used our model. We've mocked some data in the controller. We've passed that data to our view as the model. And we've declared a model in our view and then used a loop to output it. So that was all the code we did. The other thing we did was we looked at using Visual Studio to get this up on GitHub. So here's the easy way to do this. So I'm going to click on my Git menu. Actually, I have Git changes here. So I've got create a Git repository. I guess I could also do it through here, doesn't matter. So I'm going to create a repository. I'm already signed into my GitHub account. If you're not, you can just sign in. I'll keep the same name. I can put in a description if I want. And then I can just click create and push. So I'll let this run for a minute, then I'll go to GitHub and we should see the new repository being created. So now if I go to my GitHub account, I've now got my repository here with all our code. Now, the other thing all our repositories should have is a README file. Now, I want to create the README file in Visual Studio. I never want to create it on GitHub, because if I do, then I'm going to have a mismatch. I'm going to have code on GitHub that's different from what's on my computer. I always want to make the changes on my computer. So we use a README file, typically as project documentation. So I'll just pull up a student project from last year. Here's Maria's.NET project. So for her assignment, she did an image gallery. So she used the README file to describe the site, right? Describe what she did, link to the live site. So this is documentation both for ourselves to describe our work, for coworkers, as well potentially for other people like employers that you want to show your projects to. So I'm going to make a README file. So back to my Solution Explorer. Surround here. I'm going to go right up to the top to my solution. I'm going to right click. I'm going to choose Add a New Item, which is a text file. And I have to give it a very specific name. It's readme, all caps, .md. And then I'm just going to put in some text describing our project. I put in an H1, that it's the .NET Core 5.0 site we're using for this course. So I'm going to save my changes, and then I want to update, I want to push these changes to my Git repository. So I can either use this little Git changes window here, or I can go back to Git here. So I'll go to Git changes. And it says, okay, you've modified two files. You've modified the solution, and I've created the README file. The status is added. Let's say create README describe project. And then beside this little commit all, I have a drop down. If I choose commit all and push, I'll save my changes, and it's going to upload them to GitHub. And in a minute, we can go back. I can refresh GitHub, and we'll see the README documentation file in my repository. So now if I refresh, here's our README file. So anytime I make changes, and in class, each time we take a break, I'll probably push to GitHub. I'll make a new commit each time. If you have any issues with Visual Studio, you can also use the command line for GitHub, and a few resources for this are on Blackboard under Weekly Learning, Tools and Resources. Here are the commands you need. Once you've created a repository, you create an empty repository on GitHub, and then you run these 5 commands to connect to it and push your code. I've also created a little tutorial here on using Git from the command line, basically right from the beginning. So you can also feel free to go through this tutorial. It's not for marks or anything, but just if you need to brush up on your GitHub skills. So that's all for this week. Your quiz 2 is due next Tuesday at 5, as is assignment 1, part A. Have a great week, and I will see you then.